In the grand theater of the corporate world, the brightest lights often cast the darkest shadows. And in those shadows, integrity is a currency not easily traded, but dearly paid for when lost. This is a truth Alara Vance was learning in the most brutal way imaginable, standing under the cold, recessed lighting of the Omnigen Tower lobby. The vast marble expanse, once a symbol of her ambition and achievement, now felt like a sterile, indifferent tomb. In her arms, she clutched a simple cardboard box, a pathetic summary of 2 years of her life, filled with a worn coffee mug, a framed photo of her parents, and a handful of notebooks containing ideas that were no longer hers to pursue. Just hours ago, Alara was a rising star, the senior compliance officer whose meticulous work had been publicly lauded by the very man who had just condemned her. Now, she was an outcast. 2 stoic security guards stood by the revolving glass doors, their presence a silent, final punctuation to her career at Omni General. Her access card was a useless piece of plastic in her pocket. Her corporate email account had vanished into the digital ether. The quiet, venomous whispers of her former colleagues followed her like a cold draft, words like insubordination and gross misconduct slithering through the air. A storm of disbelief and betrayal raged within her, a silent tempest behind her composed facade. Her mind kept replaying the final moments in that sterile conference room. The face of her boss, her mentor, Marcus Thorne, a man whose guidance she had trusted implicitly, flashed before her eyes. The easy charisma he always wore had been replaced by a mask of cold disappointment. His final words, delivered with a chilling finality, echoed in her ears. "You were given a direct instruction, Alara. You chose to defy it. This is the consequence. The promise of a promotion, the late-night strategy sessions, the shared confidence over coffee, it all dissolved into a cruel, elaborate lie. He had not just fired her, he had surgically excised her from the company, branding her with fabricated accusations to ensure she would never be a threat again." She squeezed the box tighter, its sharp edges digging into her arms. This box didn't just hold her personal effects, it held the crushing weight of a dangerous truth, a truth she had dared to uncover, a truth that had cost her everything, or so they thought. To understand the woman Alara Vance became, the architect of a justice so precise it could slice through steel and stone, you must first understand the woman she was. She was the product of a quiet town and a principled home, the only daughter of Dr. Alistair Vance, a man who believed that integrity was as vital as oxygen. He wasn't a man of grand pronouncements, but his actions were his sermons. Alara grew up watching him treat patients who couldn't pay, watching him spend hours on the phone arguing with insurance companies, not for his own benefit, but for the family of a sick child. He taught her that rules and regulations were not cold, sterile things. They were the guardrails on the highway of human ambition, designed to protect, to ensure fairness, to keep the powerful from driving the vulnerable off the road. This philosophy became the core of her being. She carried it with her to law school, where she graduated at the very top of her class, her focus laser-sharp on corporate ethics. While her peers chased partnerships at aggressive, high-powered firms, Alara sought something different. She sought a purpose. She found it, she believed, within the gleaming glass and steel fortress of Omnigen Pharmaceuticals. Their corporate motto, "Heal Humanity," was plastered everywhere, on brushed metal plaques in the lobby and in the glossy pages of their annual reports. For many, it was just clever marketing, but for Alara, it was a creed. She joined the company's compliance division with a fervent, almost religious zeal. She was an idealist walking into the lion's den, but she saw only a cathedral of innovation, a place where her skills could serve a higher purpose. For 2 years, this belief was her shield and her sword. She wasn't just an employee. She was a true believer. Her apartment, neat and organized, just like her legal briefs, overlooked the city, but her prized possession was a small, thriving herb garden on her balcony, a patch of simple, honest life amidst the concrete jungle. It was a reflection of her own nature, an attempt to cultivate something real and good in a world that often felt synthetic. Her professional life was structured around 2 key relationships. The first was with her direct superior, Marcus Thorne, the vice president of operations. Marcus was a man sculpted from corporate legend, tall and effortlessly charismatic, with a voice that could calm a frantic boardroom and a smile that could disarm the most hostile negotiator. He saw, or pretended to see, a kindred spirit in Alara. He never treated her like a subordinate, but like a protégé. "Your moral compass is your greatest asset, Alara," he once told her, his hand resting paternally on her shoulder after a grueling meeting. "Never let this place dull its edge." He encouraged her, challenged her, and gave her projects with real teeth, allowing her to prove her worth time and time again. He made her feel seen, valued, and essential to the company's righteous mission. Her other anchor was Ben Carter. If Marcus was the polished, aspirational figure of authority, Ben was her trenchmate, her confidant, her reality check. A brilliant and sardonic data analyst, Ben could make spreadsheets sing and algorithms weep. He worked in the adjacent cubicle, and their friendship was forged in the crucible of late nights, fueled by lukewarm takeout and a shared, gallows humor about corporate life. Ben saw the world in patterns, in probabilities, in the cold, hard logic of numbers. He would often lean over the partition, a mischievous glint in his eye, and say, "You see a mission statement, Ilara. I see a statistically significant correlation between executive bonuses and the price of their vacation homes." He teased her for her earnestness, calling her Saint Ilara of the compliance code. But his respect for her was genuine. He was the one who could untangle the knots of data that she suspected were wrong, and she was the one who could give his findings a narrative, a purpose. They were a perfect team, the heart and the brain, and in the quiet moments after most employees had gone home, they would talk about more than work, sharing stories of their families, their dreams, and their frustrations. Her friendship with Ben made the massive, impersonal corporation feel like a community. Her dedication was legendary. She was often the first to arrive and the last to leave, her desk lamp casting a solitary, golden glow in the vast, darkened office space. Her meticulous nature was not a personality quirk, it was a superpower. 6 months into her tenure, she uncovered a critical flaw in the liability clauses of a contract with a third-party logistics company, a tiny detail buried in page 87 of a 100-page document that everyone else had skimmed over. The discovery saved Omnigen from what would have been a 7-figure lawsuit down the line. It was a quiet victory, known only to a handful of people, but it cemented her reputation as someone who missed nothing. The defining moment of her career, the event that solidified her unwavering trust in Marcus, came during a quarterly town hall meeting. The entire operations division was gathered in the main auditorium, a state-of-the-art theater with plush seating and a screen the size of a small building. Marcus was on stage, delivering a rousing speech about their recent successes. He was in his element, a conductor leading an orchestra of ambition. Then, he paused. He scanned the crowd, and his eyes landed on Ilara. "Success isn't just about record profits or new patents," he began, his voice resonating through the auditorium's perfect sound system. "It's about the integrity of our process. It's about the people who safeguard that integrity every single day." He then told the story of the logistics contract without naming the company, but detailing the diligence required to find the error. "The person who found that," Marcus continued, his gaze still locked on her, "is our very own Ilara Vance. Please, stand up, Ilara." A spotlight found her. The applause was thunderous. Heat crept up her neck, a mixture of profound embarrassment and soaring pride. "This is what Omnigen is about," Marcus concluded, his voice booming. "People like Ilara, who do the right thing, not because they are being watched, but because it is the right thing to do." She embodies the very soul of this company. In that moment, under the warm glow of the spotlight and the thunder of applause, every doubt she ever had about the corporate world vanished. She felt an overwhelming sense of belonging, of validation. Marcus wasn't just her boss. He was a champion of the values she held most dear. Ben caught her eye from across the aisle and gave her a wide, genuine grin and 2 thumbs up. That memory became her cornerstone. It was the proof she held onto that she was in the right place, working for the right people, fighting the good fight. It was a beautiful, shining lie, a perfectly constructed facade behind which the darkest of shadows were beginning to lengthen, preparing to consume her whole. The illusion of a perfect world, once shattered, can never be pieced back together in the same way. The cracks will always show, a permanent reminder of the fragility of belief. For Hilaire Vance, the first crack appeared not with a thunderous roar, but with the quiet hum of a computer server and the weight of a beige file folder. It was a Tuesday morning when Marcus Thorne called her into his spacious corner office, the city skyline sprawling behind him like a conquered territory. The project he laid on his polished mahogany desk was Omnigen's crown jewel, its masterpiece in the making, Project Nightingale. It was a revolutionary new drug, a potential cure for a rare and debilitating autoimmune disorder that had baffled medical science for decades. The clinical trials were complete. The results were reportedly miraculous, and a multi-billion-dollar windfall was just one final FDA submission away. Alara, Marcus began, his smile as warm and reassuring as the morning sun glinting off the glass towers outside. Nightingale is ready for its final compliance review. This is largely a formality, a final check of the boxes before we send it off. But this project is my legacy, and I want my very best set of eyes ensuring every E is dotted and every T is crossed. I want you. It wasn't a question, but a coronation. To be handed the final audit of Project Nightingale was a profound vote of confidence, the ultimate affirmation of her status as his most trusted lieutenant. She felt a surge of pride, accepting the files with a sense of solemn purpose. This wasn't just another audit, this was her chance to be a part of history, a part of the cure. She began her work with the same methodical grace she applied to everything. For the first few days, the data was pristine. It read like a fairy tale of modern medicine. Patient after patient showed remarkable improvement, their symptoms receding, their quality of life restored. The numbers were perfect, the reports flawless. But deep into her fourth day, surrounded by data logs and patient journals, she found the first inconsistency. It was small, almost insignificant. In the raw, scanned notes from a patient's daily diary, patient 7C4, a retired librarian from Ohio, had described an afternoon of blinding headaches and visual auras. Yet, in the final compiled report, the official document that would be seen by the FDA, this event had been coded as a mild, transient headache. Alara paused, her pen hovering over the page. A simple clerical error, she reasoned. A data entry clerk, likely overworked, had simply misinterpreted the note or clicked the wrong option in a drop-down menu. She made a note to flag it for correction and moved on. But then, an hour later, she found another. Patient 5. A 9, a young artist, had logged an incident of sudden, terrifying heart palpitations that left him breathless. The final report listed it as minor anxiety. Now, a cold prickle of unease traced a path down her spine. Once is an accident, twice is a coincidence. She started to actively search, cross-referencing the raw, handwritten patient logs against the cleanly digitized final summaries. The work was painstaking, a search for needles in a haystack of medical data. The more she looked, the more she found. Uncontrollable leg spasms became muscle fatigue. Severe abdominal cramping became digestive discomfort. A chilling pattern began to emerge. The errors, the so-called clerical mistakes, were not random. They all flowed in one direction, a consistent, systematic downgrading of negative side effects. The data wasn't just being managed, it was being massaged, smoothed over, its ugly and inconvenient truths gently sanded away. The perfect facade of Project Nightingale had developed its first, undeniable crack. Her own expertise had taken her as far as she could go. She needed more than a collection of discrepancies. She needed to understand the machine that was creating them. That evening, she walked over to Ben Carter's desk. He was still there, of course, bathed in the glow of his 4 monitors, a half-eaten box of pizza sitting beside his keyboard. "Ben," she began, trying to keep her voice level, casual. "Got a minute? I think my brain is turning to mush. I'm seeing things in the Nightingale data that don't add up." Ben swiveled in his chair, arching an eyebrow. Nightingale? I thought that thing was cleaner than a nun's conscience. What's up? She laid out the files, pointing to the specific examples she had found. At first, he was skeptical. Probably just a bad import script, Alara. Garbage in, garbage out. But as she showed him more and more examples, his playful demeanor faded, replaced by a focused intensity. He pulled his keyboard closer, his fingers flying across the keys with a speed and precision that always amazed her. He wasn't just looking at the files she gave him, he was diving into the system's underbelly, into the metadata, the change logs, the digital fingerprints left behind by every single transaction. For an hour, the only sounds were the soft clicking of his keys and the low hum of the servers. The rest of the office had emptied out, leaving them alone in the vast, silent space. Finally, he stopped. He leaned back in his chair, his face pale in the monitor glow. "Oh, this is not a glitch," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "This is art." He turned one of his screens towards her. On it was a complex diagram of the data flow. "Look," he said, pointing to a small, almost hidden subroutine. "Every time a patient file is finalized, the data is passed through this secondary process. It's a sanitizing script. It's programmed to look for keywords. I'm talking hundreds of them. Seizure, blackout, paralysis, psychosis, arrhythmia, all the terrifying stuff. But it doesn't delete the entries. That would leave a hole, a red flag. No, this is much smarter." He typed a few more commands, and a new window popped up, showing two versions of a report side by side. It recategorizes them. It finds the keyword seizure and swaps it with the medical code for dizzy spell. It finds suicidal ideation and replaces it with low mood. It's an automated, industrial-scale deception, running silently in the background, designed by a master. The changes are so subtle, spread across thousands of data points, that unless you did exactly what you just did, comparing the original source to the final product on a massive scale, you'd never, ever see it. Ilara stared at the screen, a profound coldness seeping into her bones. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't negligence. This was a deliberate, meticulously crafted fraud on a scale she could barely comprehend. They were hiding potentially lethal side effects to rush a drug to market. The company's mission, heal humanity, felt like a sick, twisted joke. They weren't healing humanity. They were willing to risk it, to sacrifice an unknown number of lives on the altar of profit and stock prices. The crack in the facade had just splintered, breaking wide open into a horrifying chasm. And she and Ben were standing right on the edge, staring down into a darkness far deeper than they had ever imagined. The hours that followed their discovery were a blur of adrenaline and whispered, frantic debate. Ilara and Ben sat huddled in the sterile glow of his monitors, the damning evidence displayed before them like a digital ghost at a feast. For Ben, the data analyst, the path forward was shrouded in fog and fear. "This is not a report, Ilara. It's a landmine," he hissed, his usual sarcastic cool having evaporated, leaving behind a raw, nervous energy. "You don't just hand this to someone. The people who built this machine, they are not low-level clerks. This is sophisticated. This is high up. We could be painting targets on our backs." But for Ilara, the daughter of a man who fought for his patients, the path was a straight, unwavering line. Her fear was eclipsed by a burning sense of duty. "This is exactly why we have to take it to him, Ben," she argued, her voice firm with a conviction he couldn't match. "It's Marcus. He would be horrified. He built his career on integrity. He needs to know what's happening inside his own division. He'll protect us. He'll do the right thing." Her faith in Marcus Thorne was a fortress, built stone by stone with every word of encouragement, every public praise, every shared vision of an ethical, noble omni-general. It was this faith that led her, the very next morning, to his office door. She carried a sleek, black USB drive in her pocket and a single-page executive summary in her hand, her arguments marshaled, her facts indisputable. She walked past his assistant with a confident nod and entered the familiar, sunlit space. Marcus was on the phone, but he smiled warmly, gesturing for her to sit. As he finished his call, he leaned back, the picture of a relaxed, powerful executive. "Alara, to what do I owe the pleasure? You look serious." She took a deep breath. "Marcus, I found something in the Nightingale audit. Something deeply disturbing." She laid the summary on his desk, and, as he read it, she began to explain, her voice even and professional. She detailed the systematic downgrading of adverse effects, the sanitizing script Ben had discovered, the chasm between the patient's reality and the company's official record. She presented it not as an accusation, but as a 5-alarm fire that she, the loyal officer, was reporting to her commander. She expected shock. She expected outrage. She expected him to slam his fist on the desk, to pick up the phone and call the head of legal, to launch an immediate, ferocious investigation. Instead, Marcus did none of those things. He finished reading the summary, placed it face down on his desk, and then looked at her. His face was a mask of calm, thoughtful concern, but his eyes were unnervingly still. There was no flicker of shock, no flash of anger. There was only a cold, unnerving placidity. "Ilara," he said, his voice a low, soothing baritone. "Your diligence is, as always, second to none. This is precisely why you are the best at what you do." The praise was a familiar comfort, but this time it felt different, like a silken glove being pulled over a clenched fist. "However," he continued, steepling his fingers, "we must proceed with extreme caution. An allegation of this magnitude could cause irreparable damage to the company, to the thousands of good people who work here, if it turns out to be a misinterpretation." He stood up and walked to the window, gazing out at the city below. These data systems are incredibly complex. What looks like a malicious script to the layman could, in fact, be a poorly designed integration algorithm from a third-party vendor. It could be a ghost in the machine, a spectacular but ultimately harmless glitch. He turned back to face her, his expression now one of paternal wisdom. "I need you to trust me on this. You have done your duty by bringing this to my attention. Now, you must let me do mine." He walked back to the desk and extended his hand. "Give me the drive. I will personally and discreetly launch a high-level inquiry. We'll bring in external auditors if we have to. But this must stay between us for now. We can't risk a panic over what might be nothing. Can you do that for me, Alara? Can you trust me to handle this?" It was a masterful performance. He had praised her, subtly questioned her conclusion, framed his secrecy as prudence, and asserted his authority all in a single seamless motion. Her idealistic heart, so desperate to believe in him, won out over the cold knot of dread in her stomach. She placed the USB drive into his outstretched hand. It felt heavier than it should, as if she were handing over not just data, but her own last line of defense. The days that followed were a special kind of torture. An unnerving, deafening silence descended. Ilara went to work each day, expecting something: an emergency meeting, a company-wide email, a quiet summons back to Marcus's office. But there was nothing. Project Nightingale continued its inexorable march toward FDA submission. Life went on as normal, except it wasn't. The atmosphere had changed. When she passed Marcus in the hallway, his once warm smile was now a tight, fleeting gesture. His eyes would dart away, avoiding hers. Her emails asking for an update were met with curt, one-sentence replies: "The inquiry is ongoing," or "We are handling it." She was being stonewalled, gently but firmly pushed out of the very process she had initiated. The fortress of her faith began to crumble, stone by stone. The most painful blow, however, came from Ben. He began to avoid her. The easy camaraderie, the shared jokes over the cubicle wall, the late-night pizza sessions, they all vanished. He would have his headphones on constantly, his eyes glued to his screens. When she approached his desk, he would pretend to be absorbed in a complex problem, giving her monosyllabic answers without looking up. One evening, she finally cornered him by the elevators. "Ben, what is going on?" she pleaded, her voice low. "You're acting like you don't even know me. It's been a week, and there's been nothing from Marcus. We have to do something." Ben finally looked at her, and his face was a mixture of fear and pity. "There is no we, Ilara. he said, his voice flat and empty. He wouldn't meet her eyes, focusing instead on the floor indicator above the doors. I have a family. I have a son who needs things. I can't be involved. The elevator doors opened. Just drop it, he said, his voice barely a whisper as he stepped inside. For your own good. Just let it go. The doors slid shut, leaving Alara standing alone in the empty corridor, the polished marble floor reflecting her solitary, stunned image. The betrayal was complete. Her mentor had silenced her. Her friend had abandoned her. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The betrayal of a friend is a unique and agonizing wound, a blade coated in the poison of shared memories and broken trust. Standing alone in the elevator lobby after Ben's departure, Alara felt that blade twist. The shock that had frozen her began to melt away, replaced by something harder, colder. The warmth of her idealism was extinguished, leaving behind the cold, clear logic of a survivor. They had isolated her. They had taken her evidence. They thought they had won. They had made a fatal miscalculation. They had mistaken her integrity for fragility, her faith for naivety. They did not realize that a person with a true moral compass, when pushed far enough, does not break. They become steel. She understood the game now. Marcus wasn't going to investigate the crime. He was going to bury it, and bury her along with it if he had to. Going through official channels was a fool's errand. She was on her own, a single soldier behind enemy lines. So she began to fight back in the only way she could, in silence and in shadows. On the surface, she became the model employee. She arrived on time, completed her assignments with flawless efficiency, and offered polite, distant smiles in the hallway. But when the offices emptied and the building settled into its nocturnal rhythm, a different Alara emerged. She became a digital archaeologist, painstakingly unearthing the truth they had tried to bury. She bought a new, encrypted external hard drive, a tiny, anonymous black rectangle that she kept hidden in the lining of her purse. Using the administrative backdoors she herself had helped design for compliance auditing purposes, she began to copy everything. Night after night, she worked with a quiet, furious intensity. The office, once a place of community and purpose, now felt like a mausoleum, and she was the sole visitor, communing with the ghosts of data past. Every click of her mouse felt deafening in the silence. Every shadow seemed to stretch and writhe in her peripheral vision. She copied the original, unaltered patient logs, the raw data filled with the suffering that Omnigen had so neatly erased. She copied the sanitizing script itself, its elegant, malevolent code, a work of digital evil. And then, deep in a subfolder on a protected server, she found the true heart of the conspiracy. She found the internal memos, the financial projections, the risk assessment reports. She found the email chain where Marcus Thorne himself approved the Data Integrity Initiative, a sickeningly sterile euphemism for the fraud. She saw the projected billion-dollar revenue for the first quarter after Nightingale's release. She saw the names of the other executives who knew, the ones who had signed off, who were all poised to become obscenely rich from this lie. And in one chilling document, she found the risk analysis. The algorithm had predicted that the concealed side effects would result in an estimated 1 to 3 fatalities per 10,000 patients. It was a number the company had deemed an acceptable and legally defensible cost of doing business. The truth was far worse than she had imagined. This wasn't just fraud. It was premeditated, corporate, sanctioned murder. With the final piece of evidence secured on her drive, she felt a grim sense of victory. She had it all. The crime, the motive, the weapon, and the mastermind. She began to compile her final report, a meticulous and irrefutable whistleblower package destined for a trusted contact at the Wall Street Journal and the Enforcement Division of the FDA. She worked through the night, her fingers flying across the keyboard, weaving the data points and the memos into a damning narrative. As the first hints of dawn touched the sky, she wrote the final sentence. She attached the encrypted files to a draft in a secure, anonymous email account. Her heart pounded in her chest. This was it. This was the moment of justice. Her finger hovered over the send button. And then her screen flashed red. A single, stark box appeared in the center. Access denied. Her connection to the network was severed. Her email program closed itself. A wave of ice-cold dread washed over her. It was too late. They had been watching her. The trap had been sprung. Before she could even process what had happened, her desk phone rang, its shrill, piercing sound, an alien shriek in the quiet dawn. The voice on the other end was cold, devoid of all human warmth. It was a woman she didn't know from Human Resources, Alara Vance. "You are requested in conference room 4C. Immediately. Please bring your personal effects with you." That last phrase hung in the air like a death sentence. The walk to conference room 4C was the longest of her life. The few early arriving colleagues she passed seemed to look straight through her, their faces averted. The news, it seemed, had already spread through the corporate grapevine. The room was just as she imagined. Long, polished table, uncomfortable chairs, a pitcher of untouched water sweating in the center. Marcus was there, seated beside a severe-looking woman in a gray suit, the HR director. Marcus wore an expression of profound, theatrical sadness, like a father disappointed in a wayward child. "Alara, thank you for coming," the HR director, Miss Albright, began, her voice as gray as her suit. "It has come to our attention, through a verified internal report, that you have been engaging in unauthorized access of sensitive company materials." She slid a folder across the table. Inside were printouts of emails, perfectly forged, appearing to show Alara in conversation with a journalist from a rival news outlet, offering to sell proprietary data from the Nightingale project. "I don't understand," Alara whispered, the lie so audacious it stole her breath. Marcus shook his head slowly. "I can't tell you how disappointed I am, Alara. After I put my complete faith in you, to think you would betray the company like this." As if on cue, the door opened, and Ben was escorted in by a security guard. He looked terrible. His face was ashen, his eyes hollowed out. He did not look at her. He looked at the table, at the wall, at anything but her. "Mr. Carter," Miss Albright said, her voice sharp. "Please confirm for the record. Did you not recently bring concerns about Miss Vance's suspicious data mining activities to Mr. Thorne?" The room was silent. Alara held her breath, a tiny, desperate part of her still hoping, praying. Ben swallowed hard, a muscle twitching in his jaw. Then, in a low, broken mumble, he sealed her fate. "Yes. Yes, I did. I told Mr. Thorne I was worried. I warned her that what she was doing was unethical, that it was a breach of protocol. She wouldn't listen to me." The air left Alara's lungs. The final betrayal was a physical blow, knocking the fight right out of her. It was a perfect execution. Her word against her boss and her closest friend. Her truth against their perfectly crafted lies. She was checkmated. Miss Albright slid a single piece of paper across the table. It was a termination letter. "Your employment with Omnigen is terminated, effective immediately, for gross misconduct and attempted theft of intellectual property. Security will now escort you from the building." The words were just noise. All Alara could hear was the slamming of 1,000 doors, the sound of her life, her career, and her faith in justice being utterly and completely destroyed. The first few weeks after the execution were not lived, but endured. They passed in a leaden fog of despair, punctuated by flashes of incandescent rage. Alara's apartment, once her neat and orderly sanctuary, became a cave where she hid from a world that had rejected her. The infamous cardboard box sat in the middle of her living room, a crude monument to her professional death. Some days, she would stare at it, until the anger inside her boiled over. A volcanic fury directed at the smiling, treacherous face of Marcus Thorne and the haunted, cowardly eyes of Ben Carter. She would pace her apartment for hours, replaying the betrayals in a torturous, unending loop, her mind a courtroom where she was the sole prosecutor, witness, and judge, but where no verdict could ever bring her peace. Other days, the anger would recede, leaving behind a vast, empty ocean of shame and helplessness. On those days, she wouldn't leave her bed, the silence of her apartment amplifying the deafening roar of her failure. When the initial shock subsided, a desperate, practical fear took its place. She was unemployed, with bills to pay and a future that had been erased. She tried to fight back the only way she knew how. With professionalism and persistence, she meticulously updated her resume, scrubbing the name Omnigen from her recent history as if trying to excise a tumor. She began to apply for other compliance jobs, first with confidence, then with anxiety, and finally with a gnawing desperation. The response was a slow, agonizing execution of her career. Initially, she would get responses. Her qualifications were, after all, impeccable. But then would come the inevitable question about her previous employer and the subsequent background check. After that, a chilling silence. Promising email chains would go dead. Recruiters who had been enthusiastic would suddenly stop returning her calls. The final, brutal confirmation of her status as a pariah came during a call with a headhunter she had known for years. After a week of silence following a promising interview, Alara called her. The recruiter's voice was full of pity. "Listen, Alara," she said, her tone hushed and conspiratorial. "Off the record, your name is poison. The official report from Omnigen cites gross misconduct and attempted theft of intellectual property. Whether it's true or not doesn't matter. No reputable firm in this industry will risk touching you. I'm sorry, truly. But you need to understand. Your career in this field is over." The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just a job she had lost. It was her identity, her passion, the entire future she had spent her life building. Marcus hadn't just fired her, he had salted the earth of her professional life, ensuring that nothing would ever grow there again. She was well and truly alone, a ghost in a world that no longer had a place for her. It was in this abyss of hopelessness that she sought refuge in the past. One rainy afternoon, unable to bear the sight of her own reflection, she found herself pulling an old, dusty trunk from the back of her closet. It contained the few things her father had left her after he passed away 2 years prior: old photographs, his worn leather, bound books, and his medical journals. The scent of old paper and fading ink filled the air, a scent of comfort, of a time when the world was simpler, when good and evil were clearly defined. She wasn't looking for anything in particular. She was simply seeking the quiet company of the one man whose integrity had never been a question. She sat on the floor, carefully turning the fragile, yellowed pages of his journals. They were filled with his familiar, spidery handwriting, a mixture of clinical observations, patient histories, and his own philosophical musings. She was tracing his notes on a difficult pediatric case when her eyes fell upon a sentence near the bottom of a page. It wasn't his own writing, but a quote he had transcribed and then underlined twice with a heavy, deliberate stroke of his red pen. The words seemed to vibrate with a life of their own, a direct message sent across time and space just for her. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. She read the words once, then twice, then a third time. And in the quiet of her lonely apartment, something inside her shifted. It was a tectonic event, a fundamental realignment of her soul. The crushing weight of despair, the frantic, useless anger, the shame, it all began to recede. The quote was an indictment. In her grief, in her paralysis, she had been doing exactly that. Nothing. She had allowed evil to triumph by accepting her role as its victim. She had let Marcus Thorne and his cronies win, not just in the boardroom, but inside her own mind. The quote wasn't just an observation, it was a call to arms. It was her father's voice, cutting through the fog, telling her to get up, to stop mourning, and to fight. The tears that had been her constant companions for weeks finally stopped. The storm of emotion inside her did not vanish, but instead began to crystallize, like water freezing into a shard of ice. Her grief was not erased, it was forged. It became the fuel for a new, cold, and terrifyingly clear purpose. She looked at her pale, tear-stained reflection in the darkened window. The woman staring back was no longer a victim. She was a weapon. In that moment of absolute clarity, she accepted the truth. The official channels of justice were a lie, a carefully constructed stage play designed to maintain the illusion of fairness while protecting the powerful. To fight Omnigen in their courts, with their rules, was to volunteer for a second execution, They had the money. They had the power. They had already written the story, and she was the villain. So be it. She would write her own story. She would create her own rules. She would design a different kind of justice, one that did not happen in a courtroom, but in the shadows. It would not be swift, but it would be certain. It would not be about clearing her name or getting her old life back. That life was gone, burned to ashes. This was about something more primal. This was about retribution. This was no longer about corporate compliance. This was about personal justice. And from the ashes of Alara Vance, the idealist, a new being was born, animated by a single, cold, and unwavering resolve. They had made her a monster in their story, and now, a monster was exactly what they were going to get. A fire does not always leave behind only ash. Sometimes, in the scorched earth, it leaves behind a foundation, sterilized and hardened, ready for a new and entirely different structure to be built. Alara Vance's old life had been consumed by the flames of betrayal, but her will had been forged in the heat. She was no longer a victim mourning a loss. She was an architect, standing before a cleared lot, ready to draw the blueprints of her vengeance. The first step was to demolish the remaining ruins of her past. She did not mourn her old apartment. She liquidated it. Each piece of furniture, each book, each picture on the wall was a tie to a life that no longer existed, a vulnerability she could not afford. She sold them with a cold, transactional efficiency, converting her memories into capital. The process was a ritual of erasure. She shredded old documents, deleted her personal social media accounts, and closed the bank accounts tied to her name, transferring the funds into a series of anonymous, untraceable digital wallets. Her new home was a small, furnished apartment in a sprawling, nondescript complex on the other side of the city, the kind of place where no one knew their neighbors, where anonymity was the default state of being. The apartment was a sterile, impersonal box, with beige walls and generic furniture. It was not a home. It was a command center, a ghost's lair. Here, she began her new life. She paid her rent in cash. She used burner phones, swapping them out every few weeks. She communicated only through encrypted email accounts, accessed via layers of virtual private networks, her digital footprint, now a phantom's whisper. The woman known as Alara Vance, the bright, ambitious compliance officer, was methodically and deliberately ceasing to exist. In her place, a shadow was taking shape, a being of pure purpose. Her grief had been cremated, and its ashes were now currency. She took a significant portion of her savings, the money she had once earmarked for a down payment on a house, and used it to purchase her first weapon: information. Through a series of discreet inquiries in circles far removed from her own, she found a name: Julian Croft. He was a private investigator, a former detective who had left the force under a cloud of righteous disillusionment. He specialized in digging into the meticulously curated lives of the city's rich and powerful. They met on a gray, overcast afternoon, not in a seedy office, but on a weathered bench in a forgotten corner of a public park. Julian was older than she expected, with eyes that had seen too much and a cynical tilt to his mouth. He listened without interruption, as Alara, dressed in unremarkable clothes that made her invisible, laid out her request. She was not the weeping, wronged woman he was used to. Her voice was steady, her eyes were cold, and her objective was clear. "I need to know everything about two men," she began, sliding a plain white envelope across the bench. "Marcus Thorne, Vice President of Operations at Omni General, and Ben Carter, a data analyst at the same company." Julian picked up the envelope, feeling the thick stack of cash inside. "What kind of everything?" he asked, his voice a gravelly rumble. "This for a lawsuit? Divorce?" Alara shook her head. "I am not interested in the courts," she stated, her voice devoid of emotion. "I am interested in leverage. I want their pressure points. Financial records, gambling habits, hidden debts, secret relationships, private vices. I want to know what they love, and I want to know what they fear. I want the threads that, if pulled, would cause their entire lives to unravel." Julian studied her for a long moment, his gaze sharp and appraising. He saw no tears, no thirst for simple revenge. He saw something far more dangerous: a strategist. "You know, lady," he said, tucking the envelope into his coat pocket, "you go digging this deep, pulling on these kinds of threads. You never know what kind of monster you'll find tied to the other end." Ilara didn't flinch. She met his gaze, and for the first time, Julian saw a flicker of the fire that burned beneath her icy composure. "The monsters," she said softly, "are the ones who hired you." He gave a slow, grim nod. The contract was sealed. Her second weapon was an amplifier, a megaphone to scream the truth when the time was right. For that, she needed Sarah Jenkins. Sarah had been a year ahead of Ilara in law school, a firebrand who had abandoned the lucrative path of corporate law to become a fiercely independent investigative journalist. She had a reputation for being relentless, for breaking stories that made powerful men tremble. Ilara reached out with surgical caution, sending a cryptic message to Sarah's secure tip line from one of her anonymous email accounts. The subject line was a single phrase: "Property Law, Professor Albright's Seminar." It was a reference only the two of them would understand, a class they had both nearly failed. It was enough to get a response. They met in a noisy, crowded diner, the clatter of plates and chatter of strangers providing a cloak of anonymity. Sarah was just as Ilara remembered, sharp, impatient, with eyes that seemed to dissect everything they looked at. "This better be good," Sarah said, skipping the pleasantries. "I don't do nostalgia trips." Ilara got straight to the point. "I have a story for you, Sarah. A big one. It involves one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world, a multi-billion-dollar drug, and a cover-up so profound it could land half their executive board in federal prison." Sarah's cynical expression didn't change, but a new interest flickered in her eyes. "A lot of people claim to have stories like that. What do you have to back it up?" Ilara leaned forward. "I have irrefutable, hard evidence. The original data, internal memos, the names, the numbers. Everything you would need to not just write an article, but to detonate a bomb in the heart of the industry." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "But I can't give it to you. Not yet." Sarah bristled. "Then why are we here?" "I don't trade in rumors." "We're here," Ilara said, her voice a confident whisper, "because when the time comes, things are going to happen very, very quickly. I need to know that I have a trusted, fearless journalist ready to catch the ball when I throw it. So, the only question for you today is this. Are you interested in a story that will win you a Pulitzer and bring a corrupt giant to its knees?" She had sold the promise, not the proof. It was enough. The hunger in Sarah's eyes told her she had her megaphone. With her tools in place, an investigator digging for secrets, and a journalist waiting for the signal, Ilara began the final and most crucial part of her plan: the construction of her new self. She was no longer just hiding, she was preparing for infiltration. She studied the world her enemies inhabited. She devoured financial news, learned the intricacies of the stock market, and taught herself about fine art, rare wines, and global politics, the languages spoken in the boardrooms and country clubs where men like Marcus Thorne moved. She changed her appearance, cutting her long brown hair into a chic, severe bob and dyeing it a sophisticated shade of black. She traded her practical professional wardrobe for elegant designer pieces bought from consignment shops, clothes that spoke of old money and effortless power. She practiced a new posture, a new way of walking, a new voice. Ilara Vance had been earnest and competent. This new woman, this persona she was crafting, was confident, entitled, and utterly unshakable. She was a chrysalis, weaving a new identity around herself, preparing to emerge as a creature designed for a single purpose: to fly back into the lion's den, not as a lamb to the slaughter, but as the predator they would never see coming. The game of revenge is not won with a single, decisive blow, but with a series of small, patient, and perfectly placed moves. It is a game of chess, not a brawl, and Ilara was proving to be a grandmaster. Weeks after their initial meeting, Julian Croft, the investigator, requested another rendezvous on the same park bench. This time, he didn't bring an envelope of cash. He brought two thick, deceptively plain-looking dossiers. He slid them over to Ilara, a newfound respect in his tired eyes. "You were right," he grumbled. "You found your monsters." Inside, The lives of Marcus Thorne and Ben Carter were laid bare, their secrets catalogued with chilling efficiency. Marcus's file was a sordid tale of greed and desperation. It was filled with credit card statements detailing large cash advances from casino ATMs, screenshots from online betting sites showing a history of catastrophic losses, and copies of threatening, barely literate letters from illicit lenders. Julian had even included grainy surveillance photos of Marcus, looking haggard and frantic, meeting a known loan shark in a dimly lit parking garage. The man who projected an aura of absolute control and success was, in reality, a man drowning in debt, one bad bet away from total ruin. His charisma was a mask, his confidence a performance. He was a house of cards, waiting for a breath of wind. Ben's file was not a story of vice, but of tragedy. It was a heartbreaking collection of medical bills, insurance claim denials, and printouts from online support forums for parents of children with rare diseases. His son, a 7-year-old boy named Leo, was suffering from a severe degenerative condition, and the only hope was an experimental treatment program at a private clinic, a program with a price tag that was astronomical. In the forums, writing under a pseudonym, Ben poured out his anguish, his terror of failing his son, his willingness to do anything to save him. Alara read his desperate late-night posts, and for a moment, the icy shell around her heart felt a faint crack. She saw the man she had called a friend, a loving father cornered by fate. But the crack quickly froze over. His desperation didn't excuse his choice. It only explained it. He had chosen to save his own family by helping to destroy hers. He had sacrificed her future for his son's. She closed the file, the flicker of pity extinguished. She now understood their motivations perfectly. One was driven by a hollow greed, the other by a desperate love. Both were levers, ready to be pulled. Her first move was against Marcus. She codenamed the operation Icarus, for she intended to build him a pair of wings out of false hope and watch gleefully as he flew straight into the Sunday. Her own deep dive into his digital life, guided by Julian's report, had led her to a small, obscure online forum dedicated to high-stakes horse racing. It was a digital back alley where desperate men traded dubious tips under ridiculous pseudonyms. Marcus was there, his handle a laughably grandiose Titan of Wall Street. Alara spent a week in the shadows, observing the forum's ecosystem, learning its language. Then, she created her own persona. She became Oracle, a mysterious new user whose profile was blank, whose origins were unknown. Oracle did not engage in banter. Oracle simply posted predictions. The first was for a minor race, a 10-to-1 long shot that inexplicably won. The forum buzzed with curiosity. 2 days later, Oracle posted another, for a much bigger race, a horse with even longer odds. It too came in first. Having established her credentials, she began to reel in her target. She sent a private message to Titan of Wall Street. The message was simple, cryptic, and alluring. You seek to conquer fortune, but you are using a sword to fell a tree. There are sharper axes. I can provide them. Marcus, desperate and intrigued, replied instantly. Thus began their strange, anonymous correspondence. Alara, using complex analytics and her own sharp intellect, would feed him tips. The first was small, a sure thing. Marcus bet cautiously. He won. His gratitude was palpable. The next tip was a bit riskier, with a higher payout. He bet more. He won again. He was euphoric. She was methodically, expertly feeding his addiction, stoking the fires of his greed. He began to see her as his secret weapon, his personal key to salvation. He started betting recklessly, borrowing more money from his dangerous lenders, convinced that his luck had finally turned. He had no idea he was a puppet, and that the oracle pulling his strings was the very woman he had destroyed, patiently leading him deeper and deeper into a financial abyss from which he would never escape. Her strategy for Ben was entirely different. It was more subtle, more psychological, and infinitely crueler. She called it Judas's kiss. A direct attack would only make him defensive. Instead, she would attack his conscience, a far more vulnerable target. Through a series of encrypted transactions, She transferred a significant sum, $250,000 from her anonymous crypto wallet to the foundation that funded the experimental treatment for his son. It was an amount large enough to guarantee Leo's immediate admission into the program. It was, on its surface, an act of profound generosity. But it was the note she attached to the digital transfer that turned the gift into a weapon. The note was anonymous, of course, and contained only 2 sentences. For Leo, may he receive the healing that every child deserves. With deepest sympathy, from a former Omnigen employee who believes a company's profits should never be built on a family's pain. The message was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. It was a ghost's whisper that would haunt Ben for the rest of his life. The donation was not a gift, it was a brand. It marked him. He would get his wish. His son would get the treatment. But he would never be free. Every time he looked at his recovering child, every milestone Leo reached, every smile on his face would be a searing reminder of his own moral cowardice. He would know that his son's miracle was funded by the very person he had condemned. He would know that the woman he betrayed had shown his family a mercy and integrity that he himself had lacked. He had made a deal with the devil in Marcus Thorne. But now, he would be forever indebted to the angel he had cast into the fire. From her silent command center, Ilara watched the first effects of her moves on the board. On one screen, she saw Marcus, as Titan of Wall Street, boasting on the forum about his latest win. On another, she had the digital receipt confirming the hospital's acceptance of her donation. She felt no thrill of victory, no flush of vindictive pleasure. She felt only the cold, calm satisfaction of an architect watching her complex design being executed flawlessly. The old Ilara, the idealist, would have been horrified by these manipulations. But the new Ilara understood. To defeat monsters, you could not appeal to their better nature. You had to dissect their twisted anatomies and use their own diseased hearts against them. The long game had begun. With the foundations of their private lives destabilized, it was time for Ilara to turn her attention to the fortress itself. Marcus was dancing on the edge of a financial razor blade, and Ben was trapped in a gilded cage of guilt. Now, she would begin the siege of Omni General. Her greatest weapon was not the damning evidence of the Nightingale fraud she held in reserve. It was her intimate knowledge of the machine itself. During her time in compliance, she had been a key architect of Omnigen's digital security and data management systems. She knew its strengths, and more importantly, she knew its hidden pathways, its forgotten doors, its inherent vanities. She hadn't needed to hack her way back in. Months before her dismissal, during a system-wide upgrade, she had built herself a key. It was a secure, deeply embedded administrative backdoor designed for emergency diagnostics, a ghost port. Now, she would use that port to become the ghost in their machine. The campaign began not with a cannonball, but with a series of perfectly aimed pinpricks designed to bleed morale and breed paranoia. From her anonymous command center, she slipped through Omnigen's digital defenses like a phantom. Her first target was a confidential memo she knew would be poison in the company's bloodstream. It detailed the proposed 7-figure bonuses for the entire C-suite, contingent on the successful launch of Project Nightingale. It was the epitome of corporate greed, especially as she knew it had been circulated just 1 week after a division-wide email announced budget cuts and a freeze on employee raises. She sanitized the document, scrubbing all metadata, and sent it from a new, untraceable email address to Sarah Jenkins. The subject line was 3 simple words: "The feast begins." 2 days later, Sarah's article dropped on a major financial news website. The headline was a masterpiece of journalistic aggression. "While employees tighten belts, Omnigen execs prepare for billion-dollar banquet." The story went viral. Inside Omnigen, it was a firestorm. The link was shared instantly across every internal messaging platform. The rank-and-file employees, who had been asked to sacrifice, were seething with a rage that had finally been given a target. The executives were furious and blindsided. Who had done this? The memo was confidential, accessible only to a small circle of senior leadership and their administrative staff. Immediately, the accusations began to fly. Every executive suspected their peers, their rivals, their own assistants. The trust that held the upper echelons of the company together began to corrode. Before the dust from the first explosion could settle, Alara leaked a second document. This time, it was an internal quality assurance report she had flagged months ago. It detailed a minor but embarrassing manufacturing flaw in one of Omnigen's most profitable over-the-counter allergy medications, an inconsistent coating that led to a bitter taste. The issue posed no health risk, but it directly contradicted the company's marketing, which boasted of a sugar-smooth coating. It was a small thing, but it chipped away at the company's pristine reputation for quality. Sarah's follow-up article was titled, "A Bitter Pill. Leaked report suggests Omnigen's quality control is slipping." The company's stock, for the first time in a year, dipped 2 full points. Now, the leadership was in a full-blown panic. A massive internal investigation was launched, a corporate witch hunt. A team of humorless IT security consultants was brought in. Laptops were confiscated. Emails were scrutinized. Employees were pulled into tense, intimidating interviews. The open, collaborative environment that Omnigen prided itself on evaporated overnight, replaced by a toxic atmosphere of suspicion and fear. Colleagues who had shared lunches for years now eyed each other warily across the boardroom table. Every quiet conversation was a potential conspiracy. Every closed door was a secret meeting. Alara, the invisible ghost, had succeeded beyond her wildest dreams. She had turned the mighty Omnigen into a snake devouring its own tail. This escalating corporate paranoia poured gasoline on the fire of Marcus Thorne's personal hell. The leaks were happening in his domain, operations. The CEO, the board, they were all looking at him. The pressure was immense. At the same time, his financial situation had become dire. The oracle had turned on him. The sure thing tips had become a string of devastating losses. He was chasing his debts, betting bigger and bigger, and digging himself into an ever deeper hole. The loan sharks were no longer sending polite letters. Their phone calls were now filled with graphic, terrifying threats against him and his family. The man who had once commanded boardrooms with an easy, charming authority was now a walking wreck of a man. His charisma was gone, replaced by a wild, haunted look in his eyes. He was jumpy, irritable, and consumed by paranoia. The breaking point came during a senior staff meeting convened to address the leaks. In front of 20 of his peers, Marcus, haggard and sweating, launched into a tirade. He publicly accused his own long-serving deputy of being the mole, citing no evidence other than a vague suspicion. "I see how you look at me," he had screamed, his voice cracking, pointing a trembling finger at the stunned man. "You've always wanted my job. You're the one leaking to the press." The outburst was a horrifying spectacle. His carefully constructed mask had not just slipped, it had shattered, revealing the desperate, cornered, and unstable man beneath. He had become a liability. From her apartment, Alara watched the fallout. She had access to the internal email chains, and she read with cold satisfaction the panicked messages flying between the other executives after Marcus's meltdown. They were discussing his erratic behavior, his instability, his inability to handle the pressure. They were distancing themselves from him, preparing to cut him loose. She had not laid a single hand on him, but she had orchestrated his complete unraveling. She was the ghost, the unseen force, and the machine she haunted was tearing itself apart, just as she had designed. The whispers she had endured in the lobby on the day of her firing were nothing compared to the screams of paranoia now echoing through the halls of power at Omni General. And the symphony of destruction was only just beginning. The final move in a long game is not played with passion, but with the cold, dispassionate precision of a surgeon's scalpel. For months, Alara had been the ghost, the unseen force sowing chaos. Now, it was time for the architect to attend the unveiling of her masterpiece of destruction. The stage was set. Omnigen's annual shareholder and benefactor gala, a glittering monument to corporate arrogance held in the city's most opulent ballroom. It was a celebration of the company's record profits and, as the centerpiece of the evening, the recent FDA approval of Project Nightingale. They were planning to toast their greatest crime. Ilara was planning to serve them their judgment. On the day of the gala, her small apartment was preternaturally calm. It was a war room on the eve of a great battle. Her work was already done. The software to hijack the ballroom's audiovisual system was written, tested, and loaded onto a custom-built microtransmitter disguised as a sleek, black designer smartphone. A final, encrypted email sat in her outbox, addressed to Sarah Jenkins. It contained a single link to the secure, anonymous server where every piece of the Nightingale fraud, every memo, every unaltered log, every damning email was stored. The subject line was one word: checkmate. It was scheduled to send with the press of a single button. Then came the final transformation. The old Ilara Vance had been erased. The shadowy architect had remained unseen. Tonight, a new woman would be born. She began with her hair, the severe black bob she had adopted now, swept up into a complex, elegant chignon that altered the shape of her face. Her makeup was a work of artful deception, using shadow and light to sharpen her cheekbones, narrow her nose, and change the arch of her brows. She put on the dress, a floor-length gown of deep emerald silk. It was a dress that did not ask for attention, but commanded it through sheer, understated elegance. Finally, she clasped a string of inherited pearls around her neck, her mother's pearls, a silent tribute to the good woman who had raised her. She looked in the mirror, and a stranger looked back. This was not Ilara. This was Evelyn Reed, a reclusive, obscenely wealthy heiress and venture capitalist, a woman who moved through the world with the bored, unshakable confidence of someone who had never been told no. She arrived not alone, but on the arm of Mr. Abernathy, a lonely, septuagenarian investor she had strategically cultivated over months of intelligent online conversations about biotech stocks. He was her ticket, her cover, and he was utterly captivated by the brilliant and beautiful Miss Reed. The ballroom was a sensory assault of success. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls, the air hummed with the polite murmur of the powerful, and the scent of champagne and expensive perfume hung thick in the air. Ilara played her role to perfection. She nodded coolly at introductions, offered brief, insightful opinions on the market, and scanned the room with an aristocrat's disinterest. But beneath the calm facade, her mind was a supercomputer, cataloging the locations of her targets. She saw the executives who had signed off on the fraud, laughing together by the bar. She saw Marcus Thorne, holding court near the stage, his face flushed with triumph, his earlier paranoia seemingly washed away by the promise of his impending bonus. And then she saw Ben Carter. He was standing with his wife near the back of the room, looking pale and lost in a rented tuxedo. His son was now in the treatment program, and Ben was here to play the part of the loyal, grateful employee. Their eyes met for a fleeting second across the crowd, and in his, she saw not malice, but a deep, bottomless well of shame. She felt nothing. He was merely a piece on the board. The lights dimmed. The company's CEO took the stage and delivered a speech brimming with self-congratulation. Then, the main event. A slick, emotionally manipulative video began to play on the three massive screens that dominated the room, showcasing the miracle of Nightingale, complete with tearful testimonials from carefully selected patients. Finally, the CEO introduced the man of the hour, a man whose vision and unwavering dedication made this all possible. Our Vice President of Operations, Mr. Marcus Thorne. The applause was deafening. Marcus strode onto the stage, soaking in the adoration, a conquering hero returning from war. He approached the podium, his smile wide and blinding. He was at the absolute apex of his life, the peak of his hubris. From her table, Ilara calmly took out her custom-built phone. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild bird in a cage of ice, but her hand was rock steady. Marcus began his speech, his voice booming through the ballroom. He thanked the board, the scientists, the marketing team. He was magnanimous in his victory. This is a triumph not just for Omnigen, but for humanity, he declared. And we achieved this success through a rigorous, transparent process, guided by our unwavering commitment to science and to integrity. That was the word, integrity. Ilara pressed the button. Miles away, an email landed in Sarah Jenkins's inbox. One click, and her explosive, meticulously sourced exposé went live to the world, an earthquake that would shake the foundations of the financial markets. In the ballroom, at that exact same instant, the image of a smiling, healthy patient behind Marcus flickered. The three giant screens went black. A collective gasp went through the audience. For one single, terrifying second, there was only darkness and silence, punctuated by Marcus's confused, if we could get the tech team on that. Then, the screens exploded back to life. But it was not the OmniGen logo that appeared. It was a scanned image of patient 7C4's handwritten log, the words "blinding headaches" circled in red. Beside it, the falsified report. Mild, transient headache. The screen changed. It now showed a side-by-side comparison of Ben Carter's original data analysis, showing the deadly anomalies, and the sanitized version that was submitted to the FDA. The murmurs in the crowd began to swell into a roar of confusion and horror. The screens changed again, now displaying the internal memo, the one authorizing the cover-up, with Marcus Thorne's elegant, damning signature, clearly visible at the bottom. And then came the final, most devastating blow. The screen filled with the email chain between Marcus and Ben. The crowd could read Marcus's words, enlarged for all to see. The future of your son's care depends on your discretion and your loyalty to this company. It was an execution, a public vivisection of a corporate conspiracy. Marcus Thorne stood frozen at the podium, his face a grotesque mask of disbelief and terror, the words of his speech dead on his lips. The lie was exposed, his words replaced by the horrific, undeniable truth being displayed in brilliant high definition behind him for the entire world to see. In the back of the room, Ben Carter's wife looked from the screen to her husband, her face collapsing in confusion and betrayal. The gala had become a tribunal. The celebration had become a wake. And in the ensuing chaos, as the first screams of outrage began and the room descended into panic, the elegant and mysterious Evelyn Reed quietly slipped through a side door and vanished into the night. The silence in the grand ballroom lasted for exactly 4.7 seconds. It was a dense, vacuum-packed silence, filled with the collective shock of 800 of the city's most powerful people witnessing a corporate god bleed out in real time. Then, the silence shattered, and chaos became the new king. It started not as a roar, but as 1,000 scattered sounds at once. A champagne flute dropping to the marble floor, a woman's sharp gasp, the frantic tapping of a dozen thumbs on smartphone screens, a man's angry shout of, "What in God's name is that?" The low murmur of confusion quickly swelled into a tidal wave of panic and outrage. The journalists in the room, who had been lazily documenting a corporate victory party, suddenly transformed into sharks smelling blood, their camera flashes strobing like lightning in a hurricane, capturing every detail of the public execution. On the stage, Marcus Thorne was a man turned to stone. The triumphant smile was frozen on his face, a grotesque rictus of death. The damning evidence scrolled behind him on a continuous loop, a silent, digital prosecutor that could not be stopped. His signature, his threats, his lies all magnified to the size of billboards, branding him a fraud and a monster. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny, to command, but no sound came out. The teleprompter was still scrolling, the glorious, self-aggrandizing words of his speech, a cruel ghost of a victory that had been stolen from him in a single surgical strike. His world had not just collapsed, it had been inverted. He was no longer the hero of the story. He was the villain, exposed and humiliated at the absolute peak of his hubris, trapped in the brightest spotlight he had ever known. In the lobby and in offices across the world, traders watching the live-streamed event were already hammering their keyboards, the first sell orders hitting the market. On a news ticker visible on a television screen by the bar, the OmniGen stock symbol, OMGN, was no longer green. It was blood red, with a downward-facing arrow and a number that was growing larger and more catastrophic with every passing second. Across the room, the reckoning for Ben Carter was of a different, more personal nature. He saw the emails with his name, the ones where Marcus had so skillfully woven together Ben's love for his son and the necessity of his silence. He felt his wife's hand drop from his arm. He turned to look at her, and the confusion on her face had curdled into a look of sickening betrayal. "Ben," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Leo, what does this have to do with Leo?" Her question was the final blow. The carefully constructed wall he had built around his conscience, the justifications he had whispered to himself in the dead of night, it all crumbled into dust. It was in that moment of personal agony that the main doors of the ballroom burst open. Uniformed police officers and grim-faced federal agents began to stream into the room, their presence cutting through the chaos like a cold, sharp blade. Sarah Jenkins' article had not just been a story. It was a formal accusation of criminal conspiracy and endangerment, and the authorities had responded instantly. For the other executives, the sight of federal badges was the beginning of a nightmare. For Ben Carter, it was a strange and sudden deliverance. The crushing weight of his secret, of his guilt, had become unbearable. As the first agent approached his section of the crowd, Ben stumbled forward, his legs barely holding him. Tears streamed down his face, washing away the months of fear and lies. "It's true," he sobbed, his voice raw with a confession that was both an admission of guilt and a plea for absolution. "All of it. I helped him. He made me do it for my son." His words, overheard by a nearby reporter, became the first official on the record confirmation of the scandal. His betrayal had been born in the shadows, but his confession and his downfall would be brutally public. While the titans of Omnigen were falling, the ghost who had engineered it all was already gone. Alara, the elegant and mysterious Miss Evelyn Reed, moved through the ensuing pandemonium with a preternatural calm. The panic was her cover, the chaos her camouflage. No one noticed the woman in the emerald dress bypass the frantic rush for the main entrance and slip through a quiet service corridor. She never looked back. She had no desire to watch the inferno she had started. She had only needed to light the match. She pushed open a heavy steel door and stepped out into the cool, clean night air. In the distance, the approaching scream of sirens grew louder and louder, a symphony of consequences, the sound of her own private justice being publicly served. She hailed a taxi and slid into the back seat, the chaos of the gala fading behind her. She was once again anonymous, a shadow in the city. The taxi's radio was already crackling with the first breaking news alerts. Reports of an unprecedented scandal erupting at the Omnigen corporate gala, a massive fraud involving their new flagship drug, Nightingale. The driver glanced at her in the rearview mirror, then back at the road, oblivious to the fact that the architect of the story dominating the world's headlines was sitting quietly in his car. As the taxi crossed a bridge, she looked out at the city skyline, at the gleaming Omnigen tower that had once been the symbol of her dreams and then her destruction. Tonight, its light seemed to flicker, as if the proud, arrogant building were suddenly, mortally wounded. Her personal war was over. Her mission was accomplished. But the story, she knew, was just beginning. In the weeks that followed the gala, the corporate entity known as Omnigen did not just fall, it evaporated in a global media firestorm. The reckoning was swift and brutal. News channels played Marcus Thorne's perp walk on a continuous loop, the image of the once powerful executive in handcuffs becoming a symbol of corporate hubris. Ben Carter, in a tearful and widely publicized testimony, detailed the entire conspiracy, his cooperation earning him a plea deal that would spare him prison time, but not a lifetime of public disgrace. The FDA issued an emergency recall of Project Nightingale, and class action lawsuits, representing thousands of potential victims, piled up like mountains of gravestones. The company's stock was rendered worthless. The giant was dead. From the quiet anonymity of her apartment, Alara watched the world consume the story she had written. Her name was cleared, celebrated even, in the press. She was the Omnigen whistleblower, a hero who had sacrificed her career for the truth. Yet, she remained a ghost. She gave no interviews. She made no statements. She simply observed the wreckage, the satisfaction she felt not one of hot triumph, but of a cold, cosmic balance being restored. She had hired a quiet, pro bono lawyer to handle her wrongful termination suit, a case that was now an open and shut formality. She expected a quiet settlement, enough to start a new life, far away from the carnage. It was during a meeting with this lawyer that the story took its final, unexpected turn. "Your settlement is guaranteed, Alara," the lawyer said, a look of bewilderment on his face. "But another offer has come in, a very strange one." He explained that in the wake of the company's collapse, a little-known and intensely private investment firm, Viridian Capital, had staged a masterful hostile takeover, buying up the worthless stock and assuming all of Omnigen's assets and liabilities for pennies on the dollar. They had swept the entire executive board clean. "They're rebuilding the company from scratch," the lawyer continued. "And the new CEO, he has personally requested a meeting with you." Alara was suspicious. Why would the new owners want to meet the woman responsible for their company's implosion? It felt like a trap. But curiosity and a sense that her story was not yet finished compelled her to accept. And so, 1 month to the day after the gala, she found herself walking back through the gleaming marble lobby of the Omnigen Tower. The building was the same, but its soul had changed. The arrogant, self-important buzz was gone, replaced by a quiet, uncertain hum. She was escorted directly to the top floor, to the main boardroom. The room was empty, save for a single figure standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city skyline. His back was to her. "Miss Vance," the man said, his voice a familiar, gravelly rumble. "Thank you for coming." He turned around. Alara's breath caught in her throat. It was Julian Croft, the cynical, world-weary private investigator she had hired on a park bench. But the man standing before her now was not the rumpled PI from her memory. He was dressed in an impeccably tailored suit that radiated power and authority. He was not a hired hand. He was a king in his new castle. He gave her a small, genuine smile. "I imagine," he said, "that you have some questions." Alara was speechless, her mind racing, recontextualizing every event of the past few months. Julian walked towards the table. "Viridian Capital isn't a typical investment firm, Alara. Think of us as corporate cleaners. We target companies that have a fundamentally sound core, good patents, good people, good potential, but have been rotted from the inside out by a corrupt and incompetent leadership. We had Omnigen on our watch list for years. We knew they were dirty, but we could never prove it. To initiate a takeover, we needed a catalyst, an event so catastrophic it would crater the stock price and make the board vulnerable." He paused, his gaze steady and direct. "We needed an insider, someone with unimpeachable integrity, first-hand knowledge of the crime, and the courage to light a match. And then you walked into my life, looking to hire a PI." He explained that their first meeting had been an audition. Her cold, strategic focus on leverage instead of emotional revenge told him everything he needed to know. She wasn't a mere victim, she was a warrior. "To be clear," Julian continued, "we did not fund your revenge. Revenge is an emotional, messy business. We made a strategic investment in a precise and necessary demolition. We provided you with resources and intelligence, but the plan, the brilliant, terrifying, beautiful plan, that was all you. You were the architect. We simply opened the door for you." Then came the final revelation, the offer she could never have anticipated. "We are rebuilding this company into what it always should have been," Julian said, his voice resonating with a new energy. "But a new structure needs a new foundation, a cornerstone of absolute, unquestionable integrity. We want you to be that cornerstone, Alara." He offered her a newly created position, Chief Ethics and Oversight Officer. It was a senior executive role, independent of the board, with final veto power over any project or initiative that she deemed ethically compromised, and a budget that was, as he put it, whatever you decide it needs to be. In that moment, Alara understood the true nature of her victory. She hadn't just torn something down. She had cleared the way for something new to be built in its place. Her quest for personal justice had, inadvertently, become an act of corporate redemption on a scale she had never imagined. Justice, she realized, is not always about watching your enemies fall. Sometimes, it's about having the strength and the opportunity to stand in the ruins and rebuild something better. She had learned that the silence of a person who has endured is not emptiness, it is a forge. It is the quiet, pressurized space where pain is hammered into strength, where grief is sharpened into purpose, and where the most formidable weapons of change are crafted. And one should never, ever underestimate that silence. The world of work is a battlefield of ambition and ethics, where the lines between right and wrong can blur into a dangerous gray. What happens when one person decides to draw a line in the sand with a sword? Join us next time for another story from the front lines of the corporate world.